Dr. Lisa Kane wiped the sweat from her forehead as she stared at the strange metal structure on her computer screen. The mining ship had found it 3 days ago, buried deep inside a large asteroid. At first, everyone thought it was just old, space junk. But Lisa knew better. She had spent 10 years studying alien ruins, and this was something very different. The structure was about the size of a small building, made from a dark metal that seemed to bend light around it. Strange symbols covered every surface, glowing with a soft blue light that hurt to look at for too long. But the worst part was the sound it made. Not a sound anyone could hear with their ears, but something that seemed to crawl inside their heads and whisper things they didn't want to know. Captain Jake Morrison stood behind Lisa's chair, watching the live feed from the mining robots. He was a big man with gray hair and tired eyes. He had been flying through space for 20 years, and he had never seen anything like this. "What do you think it is, Doc?" Jake asked, keeping his voice low. The bridge was quiet except for the soft hum of the ship's engines. Most of the crew was trying to stay as far away from the screens as possible. Lisa shook her head. "I don't know yet, but look at these symbols. They're not like anything in our databases. And the way they're arranged, it's almost like they're trying to tell us something." On the other side of the bridge, Lieutenant Amy Foster was having a much harder time. Amy was one of the ship's alien crew members, a tall blue creature from the planet Zephyr. Her people were known for being very smart and very brave, but right now Amy was shaking like a leaf. "Captain," Amy said, her voice barely a whisper, "we need to leave. Now. That thing, it's wrong. It shouldn't exist." Jake looked at Amy with surprise. He had never seen her scared of anything before. "What do you mean, wrong?" Amy pointed at the screen with a trembling finger. "My people have old stories. Very old stories about things that should not be. Things that came from the dark between the stars. That symbol there, the one that looks like a twisted star. I've seen it in our oldest books. Books that most people are not allowed to read." Dr. Ryan Clark, the ship's doctor and mind specialist, was checking on the other alien crew members. The results were not good. The 3 Krathari warriors, who usually acted like nothing could hurt them, were hiding in their quarters. The ship's engineer, a small furry creature named Pip, had not stopped crying for 2 hours, but the human crew members seemed fine. Little uncomfortable maybe, but nothing serious. Lisa had a small headache, and Jake felt like he had not slept well. The human miners who found the structure said they had strange dreams, but they were still working normally. "Doc Clark," Jake called over the radio. "How are our people doing?" Ryan's voice came back tired and worried. "The aliens are in bad shape, Captain. It's like that thing is making them sick just by existing. But the humans, we're okay. Uncomfortable, but okay." Lisa turned back to her computer and started working on translating the symbols. It was slow work. Each symbol seemed to change slightly when she wasn't looking directly at it. But after several hours, she began to see a pattern. "Captain," she said suddenly, "I think I've got something." Jake hurried over to look at her screen. Lisa had managed to translate a small section of the symbols. The words made his blood run cold. "The sleeper stirs. The devourer wakes. Flee while your mind remains whole." "That's just the beginning," Lisa continued. "There's more. Much more. This whole structure is covered in warnings, in dozens of different languages. Some of them are so old I can barely recognize them." Jake stared at the translation. "Warnings about what?" Before Lisa could answer, the structure on the screen began to change. The blue glow got brighter. The symbol started moving, spinning slowly around the metal surface. And somewhere deep in the asteroid, something that had been sleeping for a very long time opened what might have been eyes. Amy Foster screamed. The sound was unlike anything Jake had ever heard. It was the sound of pure terror, of a mind touching something it was never meant to touch. Amy fell to the floor, her body shaking uncontrollably. "Get us away from that thing," Jake shouted to his pilot. "Now!" But even as the ship began to move away from the asteroid, Jake could see that it was too late. The structure was fully awake now, sending out waves of something that made reality feel thin and wrong. On planets across the galaxy, people would soon be waking up from nightmares they had never had before. Lisa watched the readings on her instruments as they pulled away. The structure was sending out some kind of signal, not radio waves or anything normal. Something that traveled faster than light and touched minds directly. "Captain," she said quietly, "I don't think this is just an old ruin. I think it's some kind of alarm, and I think we just set it off." Jake nodded grimly. He had a feeling that their simple mining mission had just become something much bigger and much more dangerous. In the distance, the asteroid continued to glow with that strange blue light, and the thing inside it continued to wake up after sleeping for thousands of years. The nightmare was beginning, and humanity was about to learn that they were not alone in the universe. But unlike every other species that had faced this ancient terror, humans had one advantage they didn't even know they possessed. They had been preparing for this moment their entire lives. The signal from the ancient structure spread across the galaxy like a wave of madness. On the great space station that served as the center of galactic government, Ambassador Patricia Wells watched in horror as alien representatives fled in panic. She had never seen anything like it. The Crithari ambassador, a proud warrior who had fought in dozens of battles, was curled up in a corner of his office, crying like a child. The Zephyrian delegate, whose people were known for their calm wisdom, had destroyed all the furniture in her room and was scratching strange symbols on the walls with her fingernails. "What's happening to them?" Patricia asked Dr. Helen Brooks, a human historian who worked at the station. Helen was an older woman with gray hair and kind eyes, but right now she looked very worried. "I don't know," Helen said, watching as another alien diplomat ran screaming down the hallway. "But whatever that signal is, it's driving them all crazy. Look at this." Helen showed Patricia a computer screen filled with reports from across the galaxy. Thousands of alien worlds were in panic. Ships were abandoning their routes. Entire star systems were going dark as their populations fled to the edges of known space. But the human colonies were reporting something very different. Strange things were happening, yes, but people were dealing with them. On New Earth, farmers were complaining about weird creatures in their crops, but they were still working. On Mars colony, miners reported seeing impossible shapes in the tunnels, but they just asked for bigger lights and kept digging. Commander Luke Adams was leading a fleet of ships to investigate the strange reports. Luke was a tough military man who had seen combat on the frontier worlds. His fleet had both human and alien crews, and the difference between them was getting more obvious every day. "Commander," his alien communications officer reported, her voice shaking. "We're getting reports of reality distortions in the Vega system. Ships are reporting impossible things." Luke looked at the reports on his screen. The descriptions didn't make much sense. Ships entering certain areas of space found that their clocks ran backward. Crew members aged years in minutes. Walls became transparent, and things that couldn't exist crawled through the metal. "How are our human crews handling this?" Luke asked. His human lieutenant, a young woman named Carol Jenkins, checked her reports. "Pretty well, sir. The crew of the transport ship Ranger reported that their cargo bay turned into a forest for 3 hours, but they just worked around it. Captain Murphy said it reminded him of camping trips when he was a kid." Luke shook his head in amazement. While alien crews were abandoning their ships at the first sign of weirdness, human crews were treating impossible events like minor inconveniences. Back on the government station, Patricia was trying to access the old archives. Most of the alien staff had fled, so she and Helen were working alone. The computer systems were acting strange, showing symbols that hurt to look at and displaying information that changed when they weren't watching. "Here," Helen said, pointing to an ancient file. "I found something. It's called the First Nightmare Archives. Most of this stuff is so old it's barely readable. The files told a story that made Patricia's skin crawl. Thousands of years ago, something had swept across the galaxy. The records were fragmented and hard to understand, but they spoke of an entity that existed partially outside normal space and time. It fed on sanity and order, turning everything it touched into chaos. Every civilization that encountered it either ran away or was completely destroyed." Helen read from the ancient text. "The few records that survive speak of reality itself becoming unstable, stars burning cold, time running in circles, and worst of all, things that should not exist walking among the living." Patricia looked at the reports still coming in from human colonies. But we're not running. Why aren't we running? Dr. Ryan Clark's voice came over the radio from the research ship Meridian. He had been studying the human resistance to whatever was affecting everyone else. Patricia, I think I figured something out. It's not that humans are immune to this thing, we're familiar with it. What do you mean? Patricia asked. I've been analyzing the brain patterns of human crew members when they're exposed to the entity's influence, Ryan explained. Instead of the panic response we see in aliens, humans show patterns similar to what happens when we experience déjà vu. Like we've encountered this before. Helen was reading more of the ancient files. Patricia, look at this. There are references here to a species that survived the first nightmare, a species that didn't run or hide, but somehow learned to live with the horror. The description is vague, but what? Patricia asked. But it sounds like they're describing humans, or at least something very much like humans. Meanwhile, on a small trading ship called the Lucky Strike, Captain Susan Price was having a perfectly normal day despite the fact that her cargo hold had turned into an ocean for the past 6 hours. Susan was a practical woman who had been trading between the outer colonies for 15 years. She had seen strange things before. Hey, Tony, she called to her engineer, Tony Garcia. The fish in the cargo hold are getting bigger. You might want to throw some more salt around. Tony, a middle-aged man from the Texas colonies, just nodded. Already on it, Captain. My grandmother always said salt keeps the bad things away. Figured it was worth a try. The really strange part was that it worked. Areas of the ship where Tony had scattered salt remained normal, while untreated sections continued to shift and change in impossible ways. Dr. Ryan Clark was documenting everything. It's like humans have been unconsciously preparing for this their entire history, he reported. Every monster story, every nightmare, every tale of things that go bump in the night. We've been building up a resistance to cosmic horror without even knowing it. As the entity's influence spread further across the galaxy, a pattern was becoming clear. While other species fled in terror from things their minds couldn't understand, humans were responding with a curious mixture of caution and familiarity. They treated the impossible like it was just another problem to solve. The ancient nightmare was awakening, and it was about to discover that one species in the galaxy was not afraid of the dark. Humans had been living with monsters under their beds for so long that even cosmic horrors seemed almost normal. The question was no longer whether humanity could survive the coming darkness. The question was whether the darkness could survive humanity's stubborn refusal to be scared of it. On the farming world of New Terra, Bill Harper was having the strangest week of his life. The corn in his back field had turned purple overnight, and things with too many teeth were crawling out of the ground between the rows. But Bill had grown, up on a farm in Kansas, back on Earth, and he had seen plenty of weird things over the years. Martha, he called to his wife as he loaded his shotgun. The corn's acting up again, and I think those things are back. Martha Harper came out of the house carrying a bag of salt and an iron horseshoe she kept for luck. The ones with the tentacles or the ones that look like spiders made of shadow? Both, Bill said, checking his ammunition. But don't worry, they run away when you shoot at them just like everything else. Bill walked into his field and started shooting at the creatures that were destroying his crops. They made horrible noises and disappeared back into the ground. It reminded him of dealing with groundhogs, except these groundhogs came from somewhere that probably didn't have physics. Meanwhile, Dr. Lisa Kane was working with historian Dr. Helen Brooks to understand why humans were so different from other species. They had been studying human culture, looking for clues about humanity's strange resistance to cosmic horror. Look at this, Helen said, showing Lisa a collection of old Earth stories. Every culture on Earth has stories about monsters, things that hide in dark places, creatures that come in the night, spirits that steal children. We've been telling these stories for thousands of years. Lisa nodded as she read through the files. And look at how the stories end. The monster gets defeated, the hero wins. The sun comes up and everything goes back to normal. We've been teaching our children that scary things can be beaten. But it's more than that, Helen continued. Look at the details. Salt to keep demons away. Iron to hurt evil spirits. Bright lights to chase away shadow creatures. running water to stop ghosts. We've been developing defenses against things that shouldn't exist. On a space station near the Centauri system, maintenance worker Tony Garcia was proving Helen's point. Tony had been trapped in a section of the station where reality was breaking down. The walls kept changing color, gravity worked sideways, and things that looked like his dead grandmother kept trying to talk to him. But Tony wasn't panicking. Instead, he was remembering the stories his real grandmother used to tell him when he was little. Stories about monsters that lived in closets and ghosts that haunted old houses. More importantly, he remembered what his grandmother told him to do about them. "You're not real," Tony said to the thing that looked like his grandmother but had too many eyes. "And even if you are, you can't hurt me. My grandma always said to say a prayer and think happy thoughts." Tony started humming an old song his grandmother used to sing, something about sunshine and flowers. The reality distortions around him began to weaken. The walls stopped changing color. The fake grandmother faded away. Day 47 of the nightmare invasion, Tony said into his repair log recorder. "Hung some garlic in the storage room like Grandma always did in her kitchen. Haven't seen a reality tear since Tuesday. Tomorrow I'm going to try playing some of those old folk songs over the intercom system." Captain Susan Price was having similar success on her trading ship. She had been dealing with impossible cargo holds and crew quarters that led to other dimensions for 2 weeks now. But Susan had grown up in a family that told ghost stories around the campfire, and she knew how to handle supernatural problems. "The key is not to act scared," she explained to her crew. "These things feed on fear. Act like it's normal, and half the time they get confused and go away." Susan's cargo hold had been everything from an underwater cave to a forest full of singing trees. But she just kept doing her job, delivering supplies to the outer colonies. When the cargo hold turned into a desert full of giant worms, she put on a hat and boots and kept working. When it became a library full of books that screamed when opened, she wore earplugs. Dr. Ryan Clark was documenting all of these cases from his research ship. He was beginning to understand something important about humanity. "It's not just that we have stories about monsters," he reported to the research team. "It's that we expect to encounter monsters. Every human child grows up knowing that there are scary things in the dark, but also knowing that morning always comes. We've been training for this our entire lives without realizing it." The breakthrough came when Ryan analyzed the brain patterns of humans dealing with cosmic horror. Instead of the terror response seen in alien species, humans showed patterns similar to people solving familiar problems. It was like their minds were saying, "Oh, this again. I think I know what's happening," Ryan told Dr. Kane over the radio. "Humans aren't just resistant to this entity. We're familiar with it, or at least with things like it." Dr. Kane was studying the ancient warning beacon again, trying to understand its message. "What do you mean, familiar?" "I mean, I think humanity has dealt with cosmic horror before. Maybe not this exact entity, but something similar. That's why we have all these stories about monsters and demons and things that shouldn't exist. They're not just imagination. They're memories." On Earth, in the great libraries and museums, researchers were finding more evidence. Ancient cave paintings that showed humans fighting creatures that looked like they came from nightmares. Old, religious texts that described rituals for keeping evil things away. Folk remedies that seemed designed to work against supernatural threats. "We've been dealing with this kind of thing for so long that we've forgotten it's supposed to be scary," Helen reported from the Galactic Archives. While other species evolved on safe worlds, humans grew up on a planet where the dark was full of real monsters. As more reports came in from human colonies, the pattern became clearer. Humans weren't running from the cosmic horror that was spreading across the galaxy. They were treating it like any other natural disaster, something to be dealt with, worked around, and eventually overcome. The ancient nightmare that had sent countless civilizations fleeing to the edge of space was about to discover that humanity had a very different response to things that go bump in the night. They had been dealing with monsters for so long that even impossible horrors seemed manageable. The entity's influence continued to spread, but wherever it encountered humans, something unexpected happened. Instead of madness and terror, it found People who knew exactly what to do when faced with their worst nightmares. Wake up and turn on the lights. The ancient entity was winning. 3 star systems had already been turned into geometric impossibilities where time moved in circles and space folded in on itself. The proud Assyrian Empire, which had ruled 100 worlds for 1,000 years, was gone. Their home planet now existed in 7 dimensions at once, and anyone who looked at it went insane. General Kate Sullivan stood in the command center on Earth, watching the reports come in from across the galaxy. Kate was a tough woman who had fought in the border wars against space pirates, but this was different from anything she had ever seen. This was a war against something that shouldn't exist. "How many refugees are we getting?" she asked her aide, Lieutenant Danny Pierce. "Millions, General," Danny replied, looking at his tablet. "Every alien species that can travel is heading for the outer rim. They're abandoning entire sectors of space." But Kate was more interested in the reports from human colonies. While aliens fled in terror, humans were organizing. They were sharing information, trying different approaches, and slowly figuring out how to fight back. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. On the mining colony of Asteroid Base 7, 8-year-old Danny Pierce was helping his parents deal with the strange things that had started appearing in the tunnels. The boy had been reading bedtime stories to his little sister when the creatures attacked, and something amazing happened. "The monsters went away when I read the story about the brave knight," Danny told his parents. "They didn't like it when I got to the part where the knight wins." Danny's father, a practical man named Mike Pierce, decided to test this. He gathered all the children in the colony and had them read stories over the intercom system. Stories about heroes defeating monsters, about light conquering darkness, about good triumphing over evil. The reality distortions in the mining tunnels began to weaken. The news spread quickly through human space. Dr. Lisa Kane, still studying the ancient beacon, realized what was happening. "It's not just the stories," she reported to General Sullivan. "It's the act of telling them. The belief that monsters can be defeated. We're creating areas where normal reality is stronger." "General," Sullivan saw the opportunity immediately. "We need to get every story, every fairy tale, every monster movie that humanity has ever created. We're going to broadcast them across the galaxy." The plan was simple but massive. Earth's libraries, entertainment archives, and oral traditions were collected and prepared for transmission. Children like Danny Pierce were asked to record bedtime stories. Grandmothers shared folk tales that had been passed down for generations. Movie studios donated their entire catalogs of horror films, where the monsters always lost in the end. "This is insane," said Dr. Helen Brooks, but she was smiling as she helped organize the cultural archive. "We're fighting cosmic horror with children's stories." "Why not?" replied Dr. Ryan Clark. "Our children's stories are about defeating monsters. Maybe that's exactly what we need." The first test came when engineer Maria Santos was working to reinforce the reality barriers around New Terra. Maria had grown up hearing stories from her Mexican grandmother about spirits and demons, and she had always thought they were just entertainment. Now she was using those same stories as weapons against impossible creatures. "My grandmother always said that La Llorona, the weeping woman, was afraid of children's laughter," Maria told her team as they worked. "So I'm playing recordings of kids laughing while we work. The reality tears are staying closed longer." The pattern was becoming clear across human space. Places where humans had lived for a long time showed natural resistance to the entity's influence. Colonies that had been established for generations were like islands of normal reality in a sea of chaos. "It's like we've been inoculating the universe just by being ourselves," Maria reported to General Sullivan. "Every human settlement is a little bit more real than the space around it." Dr. Kane was studying this phenomenon from her research ship. She had discovered that the entity wasn't just ancient, it was from a time when the universe was younger and less stable. Back then, reality itself was more flexible, more willing to change. But humans evolved in a universe that had grown more solid, more fixed in its rules, she explained to the research team. "We're used to physics that don't change. Our presence makes reality stronger, more resistant to outside influence." The revelation came when Kane analyzed the oldest human settlements. Earth itself was surrounded by a field of what she could only call reality reinforcement. The planet where humanity had evolved was naturally resistant to the entity's reality warping effects. "We've been doing this for millions of years," Kane reported with excitement. "Every time we tell a story about monsters being defeated, every time we turn on a light to chase away the dark, every time we refuse to be scared of the unknown, we're making reality a little bit stronger." General Sullivan was coordinating the largest cultural transmission in human history. Radio stations, television networks, and quantum communication arrays were all broadcasting human stories across the galaxy. The transmissions were in every human language, telling every type of story about overcoming fear and defeating monsters. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Wherever the broadcast reached, reality became more stable. The geometric impossibilities that the entity created began to collapse back into normal space. Time started flowing in the right direction again. On the outer rim, alien refugees were amazed to see human rescue ships arriving in areas they had considered completely lost. The ships were playing music, broadcasting stories, and carrying crews who treated impossible horrors like everyday problems. "How are you doing this?" asked a Krathari warrior who had been rescued from a reality storm that had lasted for 3 weeks. Captain Susan Price, who was leading one of the rescue missions, just smiled. "We brought some good stories and a thermos of coffee. That's usually enough to handle whatever the darkness throws at us." But the real test was still coming. The entity's main form was still out there, still growing stronger, still turning whole systems into chaos. And humanity was about to discover that their greatest weapon against cosmic horror wasn't technology or military might. It was their absolute refusal to let the monsters win. The final battle against the ancient entity didn't look like a battle at all. It looked like the most ordinary Tuesday morning that had ever happened in the history of the galaxy. Nick Thompson was a maintenance supervisor from the Detroit colonies, and he had seen plenty of weird things in his 20 years of keeping space stations running. So when General Kate Sullivan asked him to lead a team into the heart of the entity's main manifestation, Nick just nodded and checked his work schedule. "All right, people," Nick told his crew as they prepared for their shift. "We've got some reality distortions to fix, some impossible geometry to straighten out, and whatever that thing is that's been making the lights flicker. Standard Tuesday stuff. Remember to wear your safety gear and keep your reality anchors charged." Dr. Lisa Kane had finally located the entity's primary form. It was centered around the original beacon, but now it had grown to cover most of the asteroid belt. Space itself was twisted into shapes that hurt to look at, and time moved in directions that didn't have names. But Nick's maintenance crew approached it like any other workplace hazard. They set up floodlights to chase away the AT, darkness. They hung iron chains around their work area because someone's grandmother had said it helped. They played old folk songs over their radio because the music seemed to keep the weird shapes from getting too close. "Reactor core is operating at 70% normal," reported Dave Murphy, one of Nick's technicians. Dave was chewing gum and reading his instruments like he was checking a broken air conditioner. "The space-time fractures are causing some power fluctuations, but nothing we can't handle." At the center of the distortion, Dr. Kane and a small team had set up what looked like the strangest library in the universe. Instead of weapons or advanced technology, they had brought camping chairs, coffee thermoses, and boxes full of humanity's oldest stories. Carol Jenkins, a librarian from the Mars colonies, sat in her camping chair and began reading aloud from a collection of fairy tales. Her voice was calm and steady, like she was reading to children at bedtime instead of facing cosmic horror. "Once upon a time, in a land far away, there lived a brave little girl who was not afraid of the dark," Carol read. Around her, the reality distortions began to weaken. The impossible angles started to look more normal. The colors that had no names faded back to ordinary light. The entity tried to fight back. It sent waves of terror and madness washing over the human teams. It showed them visions of their worst fears, their deepest nightmares, their most horrible memories. But the humans just kept working. Alex Foster, a park ranger from the Yellowstone Space Preserve, was treating the entity's manifestation like any other natural phenomenon that needed managing. Seen worse during tornado season back on Earth, he noted in his report as reality twisted around him. At least this thing doesn't throw trees around. The entity was confused. For millions of years, it had fed on the fear and madness of civilizations across the galaxy. But these humans weren't afraid. They were annoyed, like the cosmic horror was just another problem that needed fixing. "Listen here," said Tony Garcia, the maintenance worker who had first figured out that grandmother's remedies worked against impossible creatures. Tony was talking directly to the entity like it was a particularly stubborn piece of equipment. "You're causing safety violations all over the place. Either you follow proper procedures, or you're going to have to leave." The entity couldn't understand. These creatures were so small, so weak, so temporary. How could they stand against something that had destroyed civilizations that had ruled for millions of years? The answer came from 8-year-old Danny Pierce, who was helping his mother broadcast children's stories across the galaxy. Danny wasn't old enough to be afraid of cosmic horror because no one had told him he should be. "Monsters always lose. In the end," Danny said into the microphone, reading from a book of fairy tales. "That's how stories work. The good guys win, the bad guys go away, and everyone lives happily ever after." Across the galaxy, millions of humans were saying the same thing in different ways. They were telling stories where heroes defeated monsters. They were turning on lights to chase away the dark. They were refusing to be scared of things that went bump in the night. And slowly, impossibly, the ancient entity began to retreat. It wasn't defeated in the way that armies are defeated in battle. It was defeated the way that nightmares are defeated, when someone wakes up and turns on the lights. The entity found itself pulling back into whatever dimension it had come from, not because it was forced to, but because there was no room for it in a universe full of people who simply refused to be afraid. "Anomalous readings are returning to normal," reported Maria Santos from her engineering station. "Reality distortions are down to acceptable levels. We might actually get through this shift without any major incidents." As dawn broke over the asteroid field where it had all started, the entity retreated to its ancient sleep, not destroyed, but simply outwitted by a species that had grown up with monsters under their beds and learned that morning always came eventually. Ambassador Patricia Wells stood before the Galactic Council, addressing representatives of dozens of species who had fled in terror from the ancient nightmare. The council chamber was still mostly empty, but those who had returned were listening carefully. "The crisis is over," Patricia announced. "The ancient entity has returned to dormancy. How did humanity succeed where countless civilizations failed? The answer is simple. We never let it scare us in the first place." She gestured to a screen showing children across human space, still telling monster stories before bedtime, still laughing at things that should have been terrifying. When you've been dealing with things that go bump in the night since childhood, even cosmic horrors become just another Tuesday. Our children will continue to tell stories about monsters because that's how we keep them manageable. And if this thing ever wakes up again, we'll be ready. The final scene showed the universe returning to normal. Trade routes reopened, colonies rebuilt, life went on. And in human settlements across the galaxy, children continued to tell stories about brave heroes defeating terrible monsters, never knowing that they were humanity's first and last line of defense against the dark. The ancient nightmare slept once again, and humanity went back to work, keeping the lights on and the monsters at bay, one story at a time.